Hi, everyone. My name is Harriet, and I will be your host tonight. So thank you, everyone, for joining us, and I hope you will have a wonderful and insightful time. This event is brought to you by Decode as part of our speaker series. As a bit of background for those of you who aren't familiar with us yet, Decode is a global community of ambitious creators and passionate builders. Our mission is to introduce students and early professionals with future jobs or potential changes in the job market. We are a nonprofit with roots in the tech and entrepreneurship community at Silicon Valley, and we teach entrepreneurship classes at Berkeley every semester. We hope to give students, entrepreneurs, founders, and investors a platform to share, connect, and be inspired. Over the past 5 years, our annual Decode Innovation Conference has been the largest tech and innovation conference co-hosted by Berkeley and Stanford students and alumni and entrepreneurship centers. We have had over 10,000 audiences every year from all around the world. Some of our notable speakers include founder and CEO of Zoom, board member of Tesla and SpaceX, CEO of Y Combinator, and CEO of Google X, among many others. Our 2020 conference back in October garnered 1.3 million views across 44 countries and have thus prompted us to kick off this speaker series in January, continuing on till today. So our next speaker session will be on July 14th, so next Wednesday from 12 to 1 p.m., which is a little bit earlier than usual, but we still love to see all of you there. You can check out more on our social media channels and get more information there. Also, we will be hosting a diversity, equity, and inclusion and tech panel on Wednesday, July 28th at 6 p.m. PDT. So definitely join us to hear from an amazing group of panelists to share about DEI in tech. Panelists include Jameson Hill, partner at Base 10 Partners, Hugh Malazzi, ex-CIO at Intuit, Carlin Martin, managing director at Deloitte, Felicia Mayo, ex-VP of HR and head of diversity at Tesla, and Promise Felon, founder and CEO of The Growth Warrior. This session will be moderated by Mike Grandinetti, faculty at Brown and Harvard, and ex-C-level executive of 8 startups. You can get the tickets through the link posted right here in the chat. So definitely come and join us. Great, okay. And if you would like to volunteer with Decode on future events, or if you'd like to discuss any potential partnerships with us, please do email us at careers@decode.build. So careers@decode.build. We will also be kicking off our part-time Decode Venture Capital Fellowship, which will be running in September until May next year. So our regular applications are still open and they're due on August 31st of 2021. So for more information, you can subscribe to our emails or contact join@decode.build. Our network of volunteers and alumni have gone on to renowned companies including A16Z, Excel, GGV, Sequoia, Y Combinator, Goldman Sachs, Apple, Google, and NASA, among many others. So now for today, if you have any questions for our speaker, you can send them via the Zoom chat, and we will try to go through as many of them as possible. But due to time constraint, we might not be able to cover all of them, but we will try to get through as many as possible. So, and also for those of you who were selected to join the roundtable, it will be after the Q&A session, so please stay and wait to be invited to the breakout room. And now we are just waiting for our speaker and moderator to come back from their interview. And I guess, great, it's nice to see so many joining us today. Sorry about my dog. He's normally very cute, but great. So I guess, how many of you guys are joining us for the first time today? You can just comment on the chat. Nice. Any people who have come back to us from previous events? Nice, nice. Just wondering, how did you guys hear about us? If you can share. Ah, nice, nice. Nice. Great, great. Nice to have all of you guys here. Thank you. Yes, we've had quite a few events. You guys can look back on our videos from our YouTube channel and you can see all the events we've had since January. We've been having like mostly once every other week and sometimes even once every week. So quite a few events so far, all with really amazing speakers. So they're all recorded so you can go back and watch as well. Great. Okay, I guess as we're waiting, would you guys have any speaker suggestions for us or any topics you'd like us to talk about or include in our speakers? Like any specific fields you'd like to see? Crypto? Nice. Okay, so nice. Finance. Oh, nice to see that we have our speakers with us today. So today we are excited to welcome Thomas Eisenmann, the Howard H. Stevenson Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School, Peter O'Crisp Chair of the Harvard Innovation Labs, and faculty co-chair of the HBS Rock Center for Entrepreneurship, the Harvard MS MBA program, and the Harvard College Technology Innovation Fellows program. Eisenmann teaches the MBA elective Entrepreneurial Failure and the MS MBA core courses Technology Venture Immersion and Launch Lab. In recent years, he has served as chair of Harvard's MBA elective curriculum, the second year of the MBA program, and as course head of the Entrepreneurial Manager, taught to all 900 first-year MBAs. With colleagues, he launched the MBA electives Making Markets, which focuses on marketplace design, scaling technology ventures, entrepreneurial sales and marketing, and product management 101, in which students specify and supervise the development of a software application. Eisenmann also created the January term Startup Bootcamp for first-year MBAs and the MBA electives Launching Technology Ventures and Managing Networked Business, which surveys strategies for platform-based businesses that leverage network effects. He twice co-led a Harvard Innovation Lab course, Cultural Entrepreneurship in New York City, in which students from across Harvard spent a winter break week in New York exploring new ventures in fashion, food, and fine arts. He also co-led 4 similar winter break trips to study entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley. Professor Eisenmann received his doctorate in business administration, MBA, and BA from Harvard University. Prior to entering the HBS doctoral program, Eisenmann spent 11 years as a management consultant at McKinsey & Company, where he was co-head of the media and entertainment practice. He currently serves as a director on the board of Harvard Business Publishing. And the session will be moderated by Shuo Chen, who is the general partner at IOVC, a lecturer at UC Berkeley, and a faculty member at Singularity University. You guys have such compact bios, I had a hard time saying everything. It's wonderful to have all of you here.
Thank you, Harriet. Somehow you left out that I spent my junior year at Stanford for all the Stanford folks on the call.
Oh, nice. I apologize for that, but very compact bio, very amazing.
Was my junior year abroad.
Ah, nice.
All the way on the West Coast abroad. Thank you very much for that kind intro, Harriet and Tom. Super exciting to have you. We actually got a lot of questions from attendees in advance who DM'd us and pinged us with all these questions for you. But before we launch into those questions, first of all, a very warm welcome. And also would love to start a little bit more beyond the bio, your personal story. Going back to really, what did you study in college and how you eventually became the faculty director for entrepreneurship here?
Wow, all the way back to college. That takes me to Stanford. So I was interested in the economics of agriculture in developing countries. And there was exactly one, I went to Harvard College, there was exactly one course on that topic at Harvard. So my advisors said, you need to go to Stanford because there's this, it doesn't exist anymore, but there was a thing called the Food Research Institute, which was the best academic center on the planet if you were interested in agriculture. And so I thought I was going to be a PhD economist doing that kind of stuff, but had a chance to go off and actually work on a project between my junior and senior year in the Middle East, a UN project in Libya, and decided it wasn't for me. So I took the very, very creative approach of going into management consulting instead after I graduated. And that brought me to business school, and that brought me to McKinsey. And but I always knew along the way that I wanted to do a doctorate, and just sort of every couple of years kept asking, is it time? Is it time? And got to age 37 and figured I was as old as I could be and sort of strap on a backpack again and give up the partner's corner office and all that jazz. And did it, had a ball. That was a long time ago. That was the mid 90s. So have been studying and teaching entrepreneurship ever since.
We're really excited to have you to talk more about your work in entrepreneurship, because you obviously have a new book titled Why Startups Fail: A New Roadmap for Entrepreneurial Success. And I think it's such a creative way of tackling this. Instead of focusing on advice, what to do, you're really focusing on all of the top reasons, what to avoid. Maybe even before we talk a little bit more about the content of the book, you could give us a little preface as to what led to this particular book.
Yeah, so I think everybody on the call will know that startups have things called origin stories, and sometimes they're actually true, and often they are they're embellished. So I'll give you an almost true story of how the book came about. eBay was supposedly about Pierre's fiance's collection of Pez dispensers and things like that. So every startup has an origin story. And so the story here was I had a couple of former students who I had worked with pretty closely when they were in business school, and they went off to BCG, and I would say didn't love it or hate it, but were plotting the whole time they were there on how they could launch a business together. They were both tall women who had trouble finding work clothes that fit well. And so that was their concept. They were going to create Quincy Apparel was the startup, and it was going to be better fitting, that's the key, affordable and stylish work apparel for young professional women. And they did textbook perfect minimum viable product testing. Couldn't have done a better job. And I probably would say I taught them how to do that. This is 2011. So it's fairly new set of ideas. They ran trunk shows and got people to pre-buy the apparel, samples of the apparel and so forth, and raised $1 million. Wanted to raise $1.5 million. That's part of the failure story. And launched the company, and within a year had sort of burned through all the capital and couldn't raise more. And I was an investor in the company. I certainly encouraged them, but I also was an investor in the company. And I could point to a lot of things, and it was heartbreaking failure. I mean, I was very close to the founder, so I saw, and I had seen founders fail before. And I mean, there's always strong emotion, shame, anger, disappointment. And so I saw that with this pair. But what really disturbed me was I could point to a lot of things that went wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint the causes. I mean, the root cause of the failure. And so here I was, supposedly an expert on entrepreneurship. What could be more important in entrepreneurship than failure, right? Depending on what you define as a startup and what you define as failure, maybe it's 2 out of 3 times. At least venture capital backed startups, probably 2 out of 3 don't make money for the investor. And so that was disconcerting. Was I teaching the right stuff? And so I set out to learn everything I could about startup failure, read all the academic stuff, read everything that smart practitioners had written, interviewed scores and scores of failed founders and the investors who backed them, did 20 case studies. A lot of the teaching at Harvard Business School is by the case method. So I did 20 cases on failed startups, and all that would eventually a survey of 500 founders, early stage founders, sort of trying to sort of separate successful and less successful startups, and what explained that. And all that culminated in the book.
Which it just speaks to how much work and effort really goes into a book that now everyone has the benefit of being able to read and learn from those experiences, with you having done all of the research that has gone in, which leads us directly into some of the top takeaways. I know you spend a lot of time really focusing on surprising findings, particularly around the six distinct patterns that really account for the vast majority of startup failures. So without really kind of spoiling some of the surprises for folks, maybe you could share some of the things that were most surprising to you in your doing research for this book.
Yeah. I guess one of the things that surprised me was the prevalence of, we're very accustomed, late in the COVID cycle here, to the whole notion of false positives and false negatives. And so it turns out that entrepreneurs, especially early stage entrepreneurs, are very subject to false positives and false negatives. False negatives are heartbreaking. It's basically a founder gets a signal that the idea is not working. They may throw in the towel, and they may read 18 months later that somebody just raised $1 billion in a SPAC, with exactly their idea. False negative. So not necessarily harmful or painful, but a blow to the ego, or at a minimum. False positive is tricky too. They happen, and this is where an entrepreneur gets a signal that the thing they're doing is working, and they accelerate in the direction of what's working. It may be it may be sort of doubling down on the feature set that seems to be appealing, and maybe just sort of surging the marketing because they think they're onto something. And the surprise here was every entrepreneur needs early adopters. You got to have them, and most entrepreneurs will love them and should love them. But it's very often the case that the needs of the early adopters are different than the needs of the mainstream customers that you need to basically grow a business to any scale. So it's really easy to make the mistake of expanding too fast, too hard, too much in the direction of the early adopters. And then when you need to course correct, if you've gone too far, it takes a lot of energy. And I've never, there's the concept of crossing the chasm has been out in Silicon Valley for 30 years. And this is a related concept, but it sort of really hit home as I started studying failures. The second big surprise was how you could sort failures. You could sort startups into situations where domain expertise of the founders really, really, really mattered, like my apparel company that I just described. Those founders did not have experience in the design or manufacturing of apparel, and it came back and just really got them in a lot of trouble. But then you pick other businesses. I don't think the founders of Instagram needed to have worked in photo sharing previously or for Kodak or whatever in order to build an amazing company. So, sometimes it really matters. If you're launching a food and beverage company, this was a lesson. It's just, there's so many really crucial decisions about packaging, and so how you make the thing jump off the shelf into a consumer's hand. When do you pay slotting allowances? How do you find basically a co-packer that will make this stuff for you? When do you go from local distribution to national chains? And so many of those decisions done wrong can turn a company into toast. So you need domain experience in some places, but not so much in others. And super important for a founder to know which side of that divide they're on.
I think that's invaluable advice, given over your 24-year tenure at Harvard. You've really guided over 1,000 students in terms of launching new ventures, and you've seen a lot of these practices firsthand. And I noticed that Victor shared the link to your book in the chat. So if anyone's interested in learning more about the book, you can actually click on the link to find out. Obviously, on that note, I also want to remind everyone, if you have questions, please feel free to directly send that in chat. And then obviously, if you're on live stream, you could send that as comments, and I think the team will filter questions my way. So I'll try to ask Tom Tom all of your pressing questions. And so with that, so Tom, back to entrepreneurship, a lot of people will say that entrepreneurship is one of the most difficult topics to teach because in many ways it's very experiential. So taking a quick step back, curious to hear from your experiences, what were some of the most effective ways or top questions that you've really tackled in terms of trying to teach and research entrepreneurship?
Yeah, so the journey, boy, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how to teach this, and so much at Harvard Business School is done by the case method, and I love it, and I think it's important and effective, but so much entrepreneurship needs to be learned through a learning by doing approach, and so I've spent a lot of the last 10 years building not case-based courses, but learning by doing courses. And they're really hard to teach. I mean, there's so many choices. How big should the teams be? Should you put the teams together? Or should you let students self-assemble? Should you give the students the project to work on, or should you let them choose their own topic? You know, it just goes on and on and on. These very important design choices. I love doing that. Still love the case method too. I still teach both ways. You know, there's a whole bunch of questions still that are, right on the leading edge of what we're trying to figure out how to do. And for anybody on the call who is from Stanford MS&E, we're great friends with that crowd, Tom Byers and all those folks, and take a lot of inspiration from what they're doing there. Byers and his colleagues are working on entrepreneurship ethics. So, we share a commitment to sort of work more of that into the curriculum. And, the question is, how do you do it? Do you have a course focused on entrepreneurship ethics, or do you just spread it into all the courses? My work with I mentioned the MS MBA program that I teach, and I'm pretty good at thinking about online businesses, internet, mobile, so forth, SaaS, direct to consumer, B2B, B2C. But I have limited experience with life sciences, or what at MIT we would call tough tech. Folks out on your side use the terms emerging tech, frontier tech, deep tech. And so, a whole different set of factors for what you need to do to succeed when you have really hard science problems or engineering problems in very long product development cycles. So, we've been fascinated with how to teach that material. And then the last point of fascination is the very, very front end of the process. So we're great, I think, these days, at schools everywhere, teaching how you evaluate and validate an entrepreneurial concept, sort of lean startup testing, et cetera, but the question of where the idea comes from and whether there's anything you can do as an entrepreneur to sort of improve the odds that you get a good idea in the first place, there's much less work done, and I haven't yet figured out how to teach that side. So I'm searching the world for educators who've got a perspective on the very, idea generation, and design thinking folks will do that, but there's more to it than that.
Speaking of ideation, one of the things I definitely have to ask you is that I'm sure in your tenure, you've seen similar ideas oftentimes pitched over and over again. There's a very fine line between being very stubborn and keep on working at it until it works out versus this is just one of the top tar pits of ideas where almost all of them go to die and you should move on earlier. So how do you draw the balance between being encouraging and empowering to students versus encouraging?
Sure, I have a list of 10 or so of them. Ideas we always see. You can sort of abbreviate ideas. You take the first letter of each of those. Group travel, a lot of it has to do with what 25 to 30-year-olds, what goes on in their life. So group travel planning is one. We MBAs are all going to jet off to Iceland, and it's so hard to coordinate our busy schedules. So, and Google Docs is just a clunky way to do it. So let's build an app. The classic one, if you have 100 college students or graduate students and you do a hackathon, 4 out of the 100 ideas will be, gee, at college, it's really hard to figure out what you should do with your life. Career services is super busy. So we should create some kind of questionnaire-based thing that will use pattern matching and sort of tell you whether you should be an architect or you know, a nursery school teacher or whatever your future holds out, and on and on like that. So and so when I see a student do one of these, I'm pretty sure it's going to fail. You have to be careful with arrogance about this, because like Dropbox was the 80th file management service, and I'm sure a lot of people told Drew Houston that he was crazy. You know, there were already a lot of them out there. Yeah, Google was not the first search engine by any stretch of the imagination. So sometimes people take a hard problem that no one has ever made work before, and they just nail it through great design and sort of a brilliant business model or brilliant product concept. But I consider my job to be as an educator, just to make sure people are learning. And I know that they will learn a lot from working on these problems and sort of wrestling with a problem that people keep bumping into over and over again. The reasons why no one has really solved it, and the students will learn a lot by basically colliding head on with whatever set of adoption barriers have kept people from solving this problem in the past. So yeah, it's okay. When it gets tricky is whether they're pursuing one of these and they're about to graduate, and they could spend the next 18 months of their life post-graduation doing this thing, because you can live for a long time on ramen noodles. And then my deal with them is like, look, I'm going to tell you now what I really think about this idea, and you're not going to believe me, because you're an overconfident entrepreneur, and you should be, and that's the thing we should celebrate. But set a deadline for yourself. So basically, if you haven't accomplished these 3 things by December, pull the plug. And I think that's a reasonable compromise between just telling people their idea is terrible and missing the opportunity to create the next Dropbox or Google.
Absolutely. In fact, I'm sure over your tenure teaching entrepreneurship, you've had both ends of the spectrum, where there was one idea you definitely didn't think was going to work, but turned out okay, and vice versa, an idea that you thought was great and didn't end up working out. So I'll try my best to incorporate some of the questions streaming into.
Can I tell you a story quickly, Shuo, on the first side? Yeah. So yeah. Some folks will be familiar with thredUP. It's secondhand clothing marketplace there in San Francisco, started by former students of mine. The first idea for this, and it's big business, they just went public in a SPAC. They've been at it for 12 years or something like that, and raised hundreds of millions of capital. But the first idea was peer-to-peer swapping of men's shirts, hipster men, because my student had a closet full of clothing, and he was tired of some of his shirts, and he was sure that other 27-year-old males had shirts that he'd like to wear. So, stuff it in an envelope, go on the website and swap the shirts. And I said, James, I think there might be a market there. I mean, I don't understand much about hipster shirts, but I suspect that it's 10,000 people and they all live in Williamsburg. And you're going to sort of plateau after you find those 10,000 people. And his attitude was like, what do you know about this old man? And he probably was right. And he went away and he did it. And he came back a year later and said, you were right. I did it. It topped out at 10,000. But then we discovered a thing. People were using the envelopes. Military families with 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds were stuffing the children's clothing in the envelope. They were no longer embedded in their back home community. They were sort of on army bases and so forth. And they were basically, and kids grow out of clothing super fast. So they were basically using it to sort of recycle secondhand stuff. And that, so that was a new lease on life for the business, and quickly moved from that to women's and eventually men's clothing. And, now a big publicly traded company. So the lesson there was be very, very careful before you tell an entrepreneur that they have a terrible idea, because they may be just one pivot away from a brilliant idea. So You learn some humility if you do this for a few years.
Absolutely agreed. In fact, I'll try to incorporate some of the great questions that are streaming in on chat. I'll try my best to get to everyone's question, but one that's directly related to our conversation now is, how much weight would you give to chance and luck in success as an entrepreneur?
Boy, I know the cliche response is that you make your luck, if you're prepared. That there's a lot of luck in timing. There are asteroid strikes out there. COVID was a big one, right? Literally hundreds of thousands of businesses wiped out. And that's just bad luck. And sometimes it's more localized. You were very dependent on a certain customer or something like that, and just something weird happens. The regulators do something unpredictable. So there's no doubt that when you study failure, you sort it into mistakes, things that reasonably could have been avoided, and misfortunes, things that are more or less out of control of the entrepreneur. And a failure is almost always a blend of the two. But there are absolutely failures that are 100% misfortune, no fault of the entrepreneur.
Absolutely. In fact, when we look at data in the past, you could argue that actually some of the best companies that have survived until now were started in some of the toughest times. So it's not necessarily all bad. It could also be that the entrepreneurs who kind of survived through the toughest times also were just ones who were both lucky, but also had a lot of grit.
Yeah, no, I think you're onto something there. I mean, there's a lot of it's my dare to be great sort of motivate the students speech that I give during the pandemic. And I actually, if you go back to 2008 and 9, 10, basically in the jaws of the Great Recession, in some ways scarier than the pandemic. We thought the whole economy was going to. You'll remember it. Some of the folks on the call will. Some were sort of probably in middle school when it happened. But the most successful startups out of Harvard Business School ever came in that period. And there was a lot going on, right? There weren't regular jobs. So a whole bunch of MBAs who might have gone off to Goldman Sachs or it's in your background, I think.
Guilty.
They did an entrepreneurship thing, and they had more time to work on it because there were fewer other distractions in their life. And there was less venture capital funding. So if you managed to get funding, it was probably a pretty good idea because the VCs had the pick of the litter. And there were fewer competitors. So you got a little more runway in terms of shelter from competition. And big companies basically, ostrich-like sort of head in the sand, just sort of trying to keep it together. So they slept while people sort of colonized their space. And so I think it's not an accident. I think some of the same thing will happen coming out of the pandemic. We'll see some fantastic startups for exactly those same reasons.
Absolutely. And I think Cervantes actually asked a great question. He was wondering if there's any key success factors or startup CEO traits that were different for internet companies, say back in the late 90s to early 2000s versus today.
Yeah, it was a weird time, to launch an internet company in 1999. Stuff that you could do on AWS for $200, was probably a server that would cost you $250,000, and then you'd have to hire Scient or Viant. There were all these firms out there that would program these things, and that would cost you millions of dollars. So that's when Silicon Valley brought in an army of MBAs because the dollars were big enough that the people that doled out the dollars, the venture capitalists, many of whom had MBAs, thought you needed sort of somebody responsible. And it was a mess, and it was moving too fast. And there was a certain amount of MBA arrogance in those days. And a lot of the bad reputation that MBAs have in the Valley and elsewhere came from exactly that period. I think it's actually gotten a lot better since then. MBAs have gotten some humility, and they've also learned a lot about how to contribute in a startup. So that's a big difference. Sort of the leadership of those firms look very, very different than the technical thing. Drew Houston wouldn't have run an internet company in 1999. but he's sort of the prototypical founder of Dropbox. Sort of MIT computer science graduate, who just has a great idea and some coding skill, and boom, off he goes. That wasn't the mode in those days.
Absolutely. And in fact, I think Michael also has a great follow-up question that's directly related. When you look at these companies and you think about some of the ones that are doing well, are the best solutions the ones that typically do well, or are there failures that companies would make that prevent the best ideas from succeeding?
So it's, we have to separate the idea. Depends whether you define the idea as the product, right? So there are plenty of examples of great product that fail because they can't get the go-to-market strategy together, and that is a failing, I think, of a lot of technical founders, that they have neither the experience nor the orientation. So Quincy, this company that I introduced at the beginning, the catalyst for the book, was actually a really good idea. There was demand for the product. They validated it through their minimum viable product tests. They launched the company, sales were strong, repeat purchases were strong. But in this case, the founders, as I said, lacked experience with apparel design and manufacturing. They hired people who had those skills. This is a business that has a whole range of very specialized technical skills, pattern cutter, fabric sourcer, quality control. So they hired people out of big companies who'd done those roles in big companies. And those people just had no sense for the rhythms of an early stage startup, where basically everybody has to dive in and help put out whatever fire is burning hottest. Fabric sourcer would say, I'm the fabric sourcer, I don't know how to do that. And then the other thing, the founders, like so many MBAs, both thought they were capable of being CEO, and probably were, and couldn't figure out who was going to be the boss. So they shared the CEO role, and that inevitably slows things down. Sometimes it works, but usually it slows things down. They raised money from VCs. Sorry, I know that's your day job, but there's certain businesses that shouldn't raise venture capital money. They position themselves as direct to consumer, which they were. It feels like tech, but really it was a apparel design and manufacturing with inventory, lots of inventory. And not only that, but fashion goes out of fashion. So if you build the inventory and you hit the fashion trends wrong, you're sort of stuck with all this stuff. And the VCs, of course, were looking for a 10 times return on their investment. Every company in the portfolio has to have that potential. And how do you do that? Well, you push people to grow. And this team needed time to sort of work out the bugs in the production process, and grow meant lots of inventory, and inventory burns up cash. So wrong founders, wrong team, wrong investors. There are other people out there that will fund startup apparel companies. They tend to be people from the industry with experience. And by the way, wrong strategic partners. The factories that would actually make this stuff would ignore this peanut, with quirky sizing requirements, no industry reputation. So when their orders came in and, some big customer needed their stuff expedited, Quincy's stuff would get pushed. So that's an idea, that's an example of a very good idea, but all of the folks who have to contribute skills, time, money, something to the venture, just everything was out of whack there. And it's kind of unfortunate. Another team, I think, could have taken the same idea and actually run with it and won.
I certainly agree with you. In some ways, when you end on "it depends," it almost speaks to the fact that oftentimes entrepreneurship can be more art than science, because you can't put the same team, the same everything at a different time and expect the same outcomes. So it's not replicable as a model. And so that kind of leads into one of the earlier questions that Debbie asked, which I think is a great point. So where should founders go for advice? Do they seek peers in slightly more mature startups? Do they go for investors? although running a venture fund is my full-time job, I'm a former entrepreneur, and I know that certain startups should not be raising venture funding because you're optimizing for different things. And so I think this is a really great question, Tom. Would love to hear your thoughts on where the best advice oftentimes come from.
Debbie, it depends obviously on whether you're a first-time founder, so serial founders still need advice, but they need a different kind of advice. The categories are going to be the investors and a great board member. It can get messy when folks are in trouble, but by and large, the interests are aligned, and most VCs have got tremendous pattern matching. They've seen lots of patterns. They're doing their job well. They ought to be helping you build your team, sort of making contacts and introductions, helping you interview people. So there's value added beyond the money in the form of advice and contacts. I'm a big fan of accelerators and incubators. I think the best of them. I've been a Techstars mentor, and YC does it really well too, obviously, and there are other great ones out there. But the approach there is kind of a fire hose at Techstars will literally, in the first 3 weeks of the program, just shower the entrepreneurs with you'll have days where you meet 6-8 mentors in a day, and this goes on for day after day, and they're all telling you something different. So, a big skill an aspiring entrepreneur has to have is dealing with mentor whiplash, sort of the fact that two people back to back may tell you something completely different. And then peers would be the last category, and peers are going to be super. A lot of advisors and investors may not remember. There's nothing like talking a month and a half to somebody who just made the kind of decision you're making about, should I take this co-founder on? My Instagram ads aren't working, and I seem to be wasting money. Like, what do I do next? So peer-to-peer advisors, the sort of structure of an accelerator, I'd go all over the place. Just more is better, and then the art is sort of figuring out when you're just doing it for the sake of doing it, and you've hit diminishing returns, and you should just put your head down and do more work.
I really resonate with your last point on just doing more work, because a lot of it is about execution and how you actually build, and less about the idea that you start with. Even in the story that you shared earlier, they started with an idea that it wasn't going to work out in terms of target potential market sizing, but it's really in the execution process that they learned what works, what doesn't, and they kind of slowly work towards that. And so I had a follow-up question, and it's actually related to earlier questions. So for example, Roel was asking, what's the most important piece of advice you would give to an aspiring entrepreneur? And Michael had a similar question where he was saying, how can I, as a recent college grad, learn the proper skills to prepare myself? So for aspiring entrepreneurs, your top tips and advice.
Shuo, did I do a little bit of this in the pre-call? I can't remember. It's all a blur.
All good. You did a little bit.
Can I repeat it? Can I repeat it here?
Of course, please.
Yeah. So, if you really want to know what I think about this, you can Google. Maybe somebody can put it in chat. Just my last name, Eisenmann, and letter to a first-time founder. And that's actually the last chapter in my book. It's short, and it's been republished by a website called Startup Nation. And I sort of capture the advice there is, to make it short, be careful with advice. There's a lot of advice out there. It goes, Debbie, to the question of sort of, where to get input from. And if you listen to some of the conventional wisdom about what entrepreneurs should do, what makes for a great entrepreneur, it's mostly right most of the time, but following the advice blindly can actually get you into trouble. Sort of think of some of the advice you get. Be persistent. Like, entrepreneurs are gritty and persistent and resilient. Yes, absolutely. You better be persistent. But if you're too persistent, you may actually be stubborn to the point of not pivoting when the universe is telling you your idea isn't working. So, be persistent, but be open-minded and flexible, and sort of listening for what the market's telling you and what customers are telling you. Be frugal, be scrappy, right? Of course, because entrepreneurs are resource constrained. They got to be careful. If you're too frugal, there may be some specialized skill you need on your team. I mean, one of the failure stories in the book is an online retailer of home furnishings. Sort of look around you, all the couch, the table, the lamps, all this stuff. It's hard to ship. And you need people in charge of operations who actually have incredibly special experience with logistics and shipping. This company actually had sorted out the demand side of their equation really well. They had a great ratio of long-term value of a customer to CAC, LTV to CAC, and so forth. But they just couldn't get the operations together and burned through a lot of cash in the process. And ultimately, the company failed. So be frugal can get you in trouble. Grow. What could be more natural? I think if you go down the street wherever you're sitting to Y Combinator, that's like, that's the big mantra: grow 10% a week, and you'll be a success at Y Combinator. You better grow if you're going to be a successful entrepreneur. But if you grow too fast, you can get into a world of hurt, a world of trouble. And so all of this advice, and sort of even at the core, right, what's probably the number one piece of advice entrepreneurs get: trust your gut. Intuition is really important. And of course, it is really important. Being fast, being intuitive is a big advantage, so scrappy and nimble. But there's some decisions that if you trust your gut, they're so difficult, your gut is going to be racked by emotion, and you're not going to see the trade-offs clearly. You're not going to make a good decision. So my advice to a first-time entrepreneur is slow down. Go fast when you can, but when you need to go slow on the big decisions, should you link up with that co-founder? Are we getting a false positive signal from our early adopters? Or is this the real thing? And it's just going to keep going forever. Slow down, sleep on it, sleep 2 nights, talk to a lot of people who understand you and your business and trust you, write down pros and cons lists. So Daniel Kahneman, who got the sort of an economist psychologist who got the Nobel Prize for his work on decision theory, talks about fast thinking and slow thinking. And you need both. And as an entrepreneur, you need to know when to think fast and when to think slowly.
It's striking the right balance of both perfectly. And you mentioned Y Combinator earlier, certainly great resources to look into. In fact, some quick high-level stats. So there is certainly the 10% growth every week, but when you look at acceptance rates for getting into YC, they're considered one of the best, if not the best, accelerator globally. And when you actually look at their acceptance rate, it's only about 1.5%, which is actually lower than HBS. And when you look at out of the startups that get in, how many of them actually successfully make it out with a success, based on the CEO of YC, who's actually come in to share regularly, I think every half year for us. The latest number is the success rate is sitting at about 2.5%. So about 2 to 3 startups from every batch of 200-300 companies. At best, they expect to actually be a really successful example in the end. So you're looking at a lot of odds. So try to figure out all the pieces that Tom was just talking about, and striking the right balance is something that takes a lot of finessing over time.
And if I can add to that, so the odds are long, but entrepreneurs will still do it anyway, because entrepreneurs are convinced they've got a good idea, and you sort of do need to have that suspension of sanity and judgment in order to do it, and that's fine. The world and society needs entrepreneurs to sort of go out and try things. The good news, and I've been teaching an MBA elective on failure, and so I bring in failure after failure, come into the classroom, and sort of we talk through what happened. Could things have been done differently, and the students get to meet these entrepreneurs. And I worried when I launched the course that it would actually scare students off from entrepreneurship. They would sort of stare failure in the face and see how painful it was, and how bad the odds were. And somebody, if folks on the call know what Poets and Quants is. It's sort of the website that does everything about MBA programs. There'd be this article that sort of, Harvard Business School startups have sort of rolled off the table, sort of starting in the year 2020. No one ever did it again. And what might have caused that? It was Eisenmann's course. But it turns out, and I survey the students at the end, has the course changed the way you think about the odds in the next 5 years that you'll actually try to launch? And 20% do say, yeah, I'm less likely to do it. I've sort of stared it in the face and it's ugly and scary. 40% say, yep, it's ugly and scary, but I think I can handle it. And I relish the challenge. And you actually showed me a bunch of people who failed and bounced back strong. They're doing really interesting things. They learned a lot from the experience. And I can see that it hurts, but I can also see there's life on the other side of that. So I think that's what everybody needs to keep in mind. I mean, we're all incredibly privileged from the kind of education we have. And, if you've got the talent to launch the thing in the first place, you've got the chance to do that again or something else amazing. So don't worry about it.
I love the stats that you just shared, because it basically reminds us that the world needs that good kind of crazy, right? You need the kind of grit to say, I will change things for the better. So I love that. And speaking of that, I think Alexandra asked a really good question around mental health for entrepreneurs. Is there a correlation between founders and increased likelihood of mental health? Or is it the other way around, whereas founders are mentally more resilient?
No, there's been, I'm not sure it's sort of to an academic standards, super rigorous work on this question, but there's a lot of probably more than anecdotal evidence that entrepreneurs and folks who work in startups are more subject to mental health issues. And I think there's a couple of things going on that people should be really aware of. One is just the sheer pressure. I mean, there are a lot of triggers, like mental health problems can be triggered by stress. And, what could be more stressful than working 90 hours a week for, 3 months in a row? That's number one. Number two is so many entrepreneurs and folks who work in startup are young. And the younger you are, the less life experience you've had with mental illness. You get to a certain age, and I promise you, by the time you get to your 40s, 50s, and 60s, you'll have had, if you haven't had it yourself, you've had immediate family members, you've had close friends. And just when you've had the experience of sort of seeing people go through it and helping them go through it, you bring that wisdom. And so a startup loaded with a bunch of 25-year-olds is lacking that life wisdom. And then the third thing is that the health benefits in a lot of startups are either non-existent or pretty thin, and mental health issues are best dealt with by professionals. So if you're working with a team that's going 90 hours a week, you're going to feel weird about going and searching for help in the first place, which is a mistake. And then it's going to come out of your own pocket. If your firm doesn't have the right kind of health benefits, and so that'll be a deterrent. So yeah, I'm afraid it is an occupational hazard, and it's one that everybody should be aware of. And good place to go for some insight on this. If you know anybody that's in this position, make sure they get help. Brad Feld, who's a venture cap, one of the founders of Techstars, and the founding partner Foundry Group, has very publicly talked about his own history of depression and how he manages it. So, you don't have to go very far on Google, sort of Googling the terms mental health and entrepreneurship to find a bunch of good advice. And so go find it. And if you think somebody needs that help, make sure they get it.
I really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, Alexandra, thanks for asking that question.
Yeah, it's such a wonderful question, and especially important for decreasing stigma in the space. So I've had the fortune of being appointed by California governor to the California state level mental health commission. And there's a lot of state level resources available for folks who are based in California. But of course, for folks on the East Coast, in your respective states, there's a number of resources you can go to. And then obviously for students and alumni, schools have plenty of resources as well. So definitely encourage you to openly have conversations with people in your community. That's so important. And shifting gears a little bit, because we've been really talking about entrepreneurship from the perspective of aspiring entrepreneurs, early entrepreneurs. Kenny actually DM'd me a really great question, where his question was really around larger and more established companies trying to be more entrepreneurial and innovative. If they're really pursuing more innovation and a pivot that involves a more entrepreneurial setup, how would you recommend that they go about this given the existing inertia in terms of processes, decision-making, mentality against it? And how do they avoid the trap of mere theatrics, but actually drive tangible results? I think this is great for some of the more senior folks on this call.
Can we cold call some of these? Kenny, are you on video? Why don't some people come on? We're a small enough group that I'd love to see the faces. You may be in a car or something and not able to do it, but
we are about to launch into the roundtable discussion where you'll get to
so which will be more like it. All right. So so I'm kind of curious why Kenny's asking that, if he's sort of got a background in big companies, but we'll let it go. Yeah, it's actually, there's nothing about this in the book, but it's a fascinating question. And I found myself wanting to do a session. I've got a good buddy who was the head of IDEO's West Coast offices, Diego Rodriguez, and then he was chief product officer for Intuit. So lots of experience working with big companies trying to create new things. And we did a session where we compared the failure patterns for startups in my book to what he perceived to be the failure patterns for corporate entrepreneurs, people trying to build new businesses inside established companies. And we did a survey. We had like 100 people who had experience in both domains or in one domain or the other, and we listed things. And it's just basically the failure modes do not line up. It's a completely different set of reasons, and so much of the failure of new ventures inside big corporations have to do with conflict, essentially, between the corporate center, the core business, and who's ever doing the new thing. And some of it's kind of obvious, like there's sometimes a threat of cannibalization, but if the new thing gets any kind of momentum, it's going to need capital and it's going to need people, and that's going to be a threat to the core business. So the knives come out and the politics get started and so forth. If the core business stumbles in any way, then you need to do belt tightening. And what could be easier way to tighten the belt and get rid of this thing that's sort of startups by their nature burn through cash and generate losses. So it's not surprisingly all about politics, and then including the politics of forcing onto the new entity inside the big company all sorts of corporate ways of doing things. We can't run an MVP test because you want to put our brand on that thing, but oh my gosh, the 200 people that would be in the test will sort of see a shoddy product and will damage the brand. Really? And on like that. You must get two. We always have dual sourcing, so you need to get two vendors for this thing you want to buy. Really? Fighting with the lawyers, fighting with procurement, fighting with the marketing people, and on and on. It's a mess. I don't love it.
That's basically the takeaway. That whenever companies try to go through this process, it's a fight, but hopefully it's a fight worth it in the end.
Sure.
I want to make sure that students have, and alumni and more experienced folks have enough time to ask you questions directly in Roundtable. So I'll take one last question from Pedro, and then we'll launch into the Roundtable so folks can turn on cameras and mics and ask you questions personally. So I think Pedro's question is great to end on, because he's basically noting this obvious chasm between what's taught in school versus, actual entrepreneurs going into the real world building things. And he's saying, how can students or even student-led initiatives ignite and gain momentum within a university? He's based out of the US, but he's just very exhausted from the disservice of his university towards students. And he would love to hear your take on this.
Pedro, where, if you can unmute, where do you go to school? Or just type it in chat. Portugal. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So I have no idea what I've got a lot of experience with other European universities. I just think the US is a lot better at this than a lot of other parts of the world. So my advice would be go to bases at Stanford and just look at all the things they've done. And I don't know if Cal has a similar student-led organization. I mean, the very existence of this thing we're doing sort of between the two schools is a great example. I think especially for master's level students, there's a lot of agency, a lot of ability because basically on average, master's students are paying tuition, and there's a lot of power that comes from paying tuition. Doctoral students cost the university money, and a lot of undergraduates are on financial aid, and there's just so many of them. And even in the US, I think a lot of the universities have certainly true of Harvard, a paternalistic attitude that says we're creating citizen leaders, and we shouldn't allow students to, and maybe this is a little bit of what you're getting at, Pedro, we shouldn't allow Harvard college students to do anything that feels like professional training. So you can't take an accounting course at Harvard College. The college students I work with are super frustrated. So, but they do get themselves organized, and they can look at places like Stanford, which is a little more accommodating toward sort of even at the undergraduate level, certainly at the master's level. So look for role models. I do think it's better in some places. Like even in Germany, TUM, the Technische Universität München, the big the MIT of Munich, it's got a spectacular set of offerings, like best in the class, better than MIT, better than Stanford, better than Harvard for sure. And so that's on your continent at least. And I don't know how much of it is student-led, but it's very responsive, I think, to what students need to know about entrepreneurship and design and engineering. So find the role models.
And the very fact that you're here, I think, already means that you're starting to plug into all of the different things that are happening. So, I mean, congratulations and great job for even being here in the first place, Pedro. And thank you for that question. And of course, if you want other ways to plug into some of the resources that Tom mentioned, whether it's Harvard, Stanford, or Berkeley, you're welcome to reach out to anyone on the Decode team. I'm sure they're happy to make an intro for you so you can plug into the right places. So feel free to reach out to Harriet, Cervantes, and a few of the other people on this call. Wonderful. With that, a huge thank you to you again, Tom, for sharing all of your insights from your book, as well as from your tremendous experience with us. Really, really appreciate your time. And with that, would love to invite everyone who applied to the roundtable to join us in the roundtable discussion. It will be in a breakout room. So all of you who applied, you'll receive an invite to join the breakout room so you can turn on camera and your mic to introduce yourself and connect directly with Tom. Thanks so much, everyone.
Everybody.
See you there
Bye-bye.
soon. Bye.